The United States, once the undisputed powerhouse of the global economy and the backbone of international trade, is now facing unprecedented financial turmoil. 16 of its closest allies are slashing their U.S. Treasury holdings. And this isn't just a minor shift. They're offloading billions, signaling a massive shakeup in the global financial order. Japan, the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, has slashed $27.3 billion. The UK has dumped an even bigger $44.1 billion. Saudi Arabia, long considered a reliable financial partner, has quietly reduced its holdings by $15.1 billion. These are not pulse routine shifts in portfolio management. This is a signal that something is deeply wrong. Well, honestly, it seems like these countries are losing faith in the US financial system. And it all comes back to one thing: Donald Trump's disastrous policies. His economic bullying, reckless tariffs, and obsession with America first have driven even the country's closest allies to abandon US debt and rethink their relationship with the dollar. Washington assumed it could keep borrowing endlessly, that the world would always be there to buy up the debt, but now those very countries are pulling out, leaving the US more vulnerable than ever. For decades, the US economy has run on one simple idea: borrow now, worry later. The government issues debt, foreign countries buy that debt, and America keeps spending without consequences. This system worked as long as other nations believed in the security of US Treasuries. But under Trump, that trust has been shattered. His obsession with tariffs and trade wars forced allies like Japan, the UK, and Germany to reconsider their financial reliance on the US. His diplomatic arrogance, treating partners like subordinates instead of equals, has driven them to diversify their reserves. These nations aren't just selling treasuries because of economic shifts. They are actively reducing their exposure to the US dollar, looking for ways to break free from America's grip. This is not a short-term reaction. This is a global realignment, and it's happening at a dangerous speed. The consequences of this sell-off are massive. If fewer countries are willing to buy US Treasuries, who will fund America's growing debt? The US government has already crossed $34 trillion in national debt, with no sign of slowing down. If foreign buyers continue to disappear, Washington will have to rely on domestic investors, which means higher interest rates, more inflation, and an economic slowdown. The cost of borrowing will surge, hitting American consumers directly. Mortgages, business loans, and even credit card interest rates will go up. The very thing that has allowed America to sustain its spending for decades, the ability to borrow cheaply, will vanish. And the Federal Reserve? Their only option will be to print more money, further devaluing the dollar and pushing inflation to dangerous levels. This isn't just a financial issue. This is a full-blown economic crisis waiting to explode. But the problem goes beyond just borrowing costs. The real danger is the potential decline of the US dollar's dominance in global trade. For years, the dollar has been the default currency for international transactions, giving America enormous power. But as foreign countries reduce their holdings in US debt, they are also moving away from dollar-based transactions. Saudi Arabia is now openly considering selling oil in other currencies, a direct challenge to the petrodollar system that has propped up the US economy for decades. China and Russia are aggressively pushing for a shift away from the dollar, and now even US allies are starting to follow that path. If the world no longer depends on the dollar, America's influence over global finance could collapse. The country would lose its ability to print money without consequences. Its leverage over international trade would shrink, and financial instability would become the norm. And if that was not enough, you need to know that China and Russia are also actively bypassing the US dollar in trade. And they're not just talking about it, they're doing it. In December 2024, China's Treasury holdings fell to just $756 billion, the lowest since 2009. This isn't an accident. Beijing has been cutting its exposure to U.S. debt for years, but under Trump's economic chaos, the sell-off has accelerated. At the same time, China's trade with Russia in yuan surged to a record $230 billion in 2020, up from just $147 billion in 2022. The reason? Both nations are working to move away from the dollar. Over 90% of trade between China and Russia is now conducted in yuan and rubles instead of dollars. This is a direct challenge to America's financial dominance, and it's spreading beyond just these two nations. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, is actively discussing oil sales in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. In December 2024, Saudi officials held high-level meetings with Chinese diplomats to discuss shifting part of their oil trade to yuan. Saudi Arabia exports over $250 billion in oil every year, and for decades, it has done so in US dollars. But now, China, its biggest buyer, is pushing for transactions to be settled in yuan. If Saudi Arabia follows through, this would be a direct hit to the petrodollar system, which has underpinned U.S. economic power since the 1970s. Trump's trade war with China and his decision to alienate Saudi Arabia with inconsistent foreign policy have only sped up this shift. For the first time in history, Saudi Arabia is considering a future where it doesn't rely on the U.S. dollar. At the same time, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are moving aggressively to create an alternative to the dollar-based financial system. On August 22, 2020, during the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa confirmed that the bloc is working on a new reserve currency. The goal is simple: reduce dependence on the U.S. financial system and the dollar. Russia's central bank has already cut its dollar reserves to below 15% of total holdings, shifting to gold, yuan, and euros. China is increasing its trade settlements in yuan, and India has signed agreements with the UAE, Russia, and Iran to conduct trade in local currencies instead of the dollar. These are not small moves. This is a coordinated effort to challenge the dollar's global dominance. The expansion of BRICS, which welcomed Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Ethiopia in 2024, makes this movement even stronger. These nations represent over 40% of the world's population and nearly a third of global GDP. Their decision to reduce reliance on the US dollar is a serious threat to America's economic power. The biggest problem for the US isn't just that these countries are moving away from the dollar. It's that Washington has no way to stop it. Trump's aggressive trade policies and sanctions push these countries to find alternatives. And now that they have, there's no reason for them to turn back. The US economy depends on the world buying its debt. And for decades, foreign governments funded America's endless spending by purchasing Treasury bonds. But if that stops, the consequences will be catastrophic. Foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds currently hold $8.5 trillion in US Treasuries. If even a fraction of that is sold off, bond prices will collapse, and the cost of borrowing will skyrocket. That's exactly what's starting to happen, and yet the US government keeps pretending it's business as usual. The Federal Reserve is already backed into a corner. With foreign buyers stepping away, who will fund America's deficits? The answer is simple. The Fed will have to print more money to cover the gap. But that means more inflation, more instability, and more uncertainty. In 2023 alone, the US printed over $4 trillion just to stabilize markets. If foreign investors continue to dump treasuries, that number could go even higher. At some point, this becomes unsustainable. Printing money doesn't create real wealth. It just weakens the purchasing power of the dollar. That's exactly why inflation surged to 6.2% in early 2024. And it's why prices on everything from groceries to rent have skyrocketed. And it's not just inflation. The cost of borrowing in the US is rising fast. The 10-year Treasury yield surged past 5% in late 2024, the highest since 2007. That means higher mortgage rates, higher credit card interest, and higher business loan costs. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rate hit 8.1% in December, making homeownership increasingly unaffordable. Investors are now demanding higher returns because they see the risk. America is piling on more debt while its biggest buyers are walking away. The real question is whether this is the beginning of a financial collapse even worse than 2008. Back then, it was reckless lending that triggered the crash. This time, it could be reckless government borrowing. The warning signs are everywhere: skyrocketing yields, foreign treasury sell-offs, rising inflation, and an overstretched Federal Reserve. If this trend continues, America could be heading toward a crisis unlike anything seen in modern history. The worst part? It didn't have to be this way. But thanks to Trump's arrogance, the world has decided to move on without the US. And if you want to stay updated on what happens next as the world moves away from US debt, hit that subscribe button and stay ahead of the chaos.